So for time, I'm not able to look at everything that I've been writing about here with Harlem and regulations in Harlem's economic production, but Billie Holiday, if you're not familiar, is a famous jazz singer of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and she was actually pretty strongly anti-government regulation, and you see a lot of this thought comes out in her autobiography. So I will just start here. So in 1929, she gets to New York City. Eleanor Fagan sits on a train riding for Baltimore en route to meet her mother in Harlem. And she was only 14, the year was 1929. And she says that she wants to get to Harlem before she actually sees her mom. She wants to have herself a time. And certainly that she must have heard that Harlem, and this is a direct quote from 1925, James Weldon Johnson writing about Harlem. He describes Harlem as the great mecca for the sightseer, the pleasure seeker, the curious, the adventurous, the enterprising, the ambitious, and the talented of the whole Negro world. And she's a representative of a whole generation of people that historians have come to call the Great Migration. And this takes place in the first half of the 20th century. It starts right around World War I. As World War I happens, you have immigration into the United States drops off, and so there's a labor shortage in northern industrial cities. At the same time, you have Jim Crow tightening in the South. And so there's an economic incentive for people to move. And you have a huge wave of migration from the Deep South, post-emancipation, of Black Americans moving to try to find economic opportunities in the North. And so she's one of hundreds of thousands of people that make this migration. She gets to Harlem, and Harlem is a city, Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City that at the time of the 20s and 30s, there is a tremendous amount of economic discourses that are taking place in Harlem. And there's a Reverend W.W. Brown, who's the pastor of the Metropolitan Baptist Church, and he made buy property one of the things that he would preach about in the sermons, and buying property became a fever there. Madam C.J. Walker is the first female self-made millionaire of any color in the United States. She moves to Harlem in 1917, and she brings her hair care business, she brings all of her capital with her as well, and her money really funds a lot of the civil society organizations and voluntary mutual aid societies that are happening in Harlem during the 20s and 30s. She addresses the National Negro Business League when she gets to Harlem, and she says, this is C.J. Walker, I am a woman who came from the cotton fields of the South. I was promoted from there to the wash tub. Then I was promoted to the cook kitchen. And from there, I promoted myself into the business of manufacturing hair goods and preparations. I have built my own factory on my own ground. There is no royal flower-strewn path to success. And if there is, I have not found it, for if I have accomplished anything in life, it's because I've been willing to work hard. In 1923, Harlem's National Urban League, they begin publishing Opportunity magazine, and their tagline was not alms, but opportunity. And so there's a couple other quotes here, but I'm going to move faster through this. Marcus Garvey he shows up in Harlem, and he's like the founder of Black nationalist thought. And he says that without commerce and industry, a people perish economically. And in his estimation, the Negro was perishing because he had no economic system, no commerce, no industry, and he thought that there was a far way to go towards a goal of getting more stores, more banks, and bigger enterprises in Black communities, run and owned by Black Americans in Harlem during the 20s. So there is a lot of discourse in Harlem around economics, around entrepreneurship. These images, I'm just going to show a few pictures just to show the aspirations. You can see like the aesthetic mood of Harlem. These young women here, they're clearly what other critics of this time period, people who write about Harlem, mostly in like Africana studies and that kind of field, they usually come from a Marxist framework, and so they would criticize. There's a criticism of the Harlem Renaissance for being overly bourgeois, for like aspiring to bourgeois values, and they say that that's a bad thing. I necessarily don't agree with that. I think there's nothing wrong with bourgeois values and aspiring to some kind of materialism, especially if you're you're one or two generations removed from slavery. I don't understand why anyone would judge people who get to Harlem and want to actually make money. That seems really silly to me. So, some more imaging. This is James Vanderzee is a photographer in Harlem during the 20s, and clearly you see this is a picture of opulence. And if you are someone who lives in the Jim Crow South at the same exact time, if you're getting images of Harlem that look like this, then this is where you want to go, because you that was designed by Aaron Douglas, who's a modernist painter. It's the February 1926 issue celebrating industry. This just screams Ayn Rand to me. So she would have loved this, the way they're celebrating industry as being this like life-giving force. So these discourses in Harlem are happening. Billie Holiday shows up in Harlem at this time, and she herself was a kind of plucky entrepreneurial type as a teenager, or earlier in Baltimore where she started. She described herself as very commercial, and she had figured out that if she used to scrub steps, and she figured out that if she bought her own soap and her own bucket and brush, she could actually charge her customers more money. So she has this inner full sense of recapitalizing her money into her own business. And so this is just a picture of Harlem, of business and industry, and there's a lot of commerce that's happening in this city. So to move into looking at Billie Holiday's actual economic thoughts, like I said, I'm using the Virginia School of Political Economy as the lens to analyze what's actually happening in the way she's criticizing government regulations that are actually getting in the way of this kind of commercial enterprising that a lot of Black Americans are showing up here trying to do. And I don't think I need to overly explain Virginia School of Political Economy and public choice for this crowd, but just briefly. Virginia, or just say public choice. Public choice looks at three different things. The rational ignorance of the voter, which means that no one voter has a rational self-interest in getting as much information as they possibly could about every single piece of legislation that's going to come before their elected representative. There's just not enough time in the day to be as informed as you possibly could. So that's why in a democratic electoral system we have representatives. We are assuming that they're going to know more about some of these issues in more specific ways than any one voter has the time to do. At the same time, the politicians have their own self-interest because they are self-interested actors as well. And so their self-interest is in promoting and sustaining their own political careers. And people express their preferences on the voting market through votes instead of through dollars and through purchases as we do on an economic market. And so voter preferences get expressed through votes, and politicians follow and go after those votes however they can. What you also end up happening then, the third part of Virginia School of Political Economy, is that you get special interest groups that have an interest in however much money or goodies they can get from certain politicians. They have an interest in working towards that. So my friend Zach here wrote a blog on Students for Liberty's website that makes this analogy that if you have $3 million worth of political givings, then some firm or company or special interest group it's rational for them to spend $2.999999 million in order to get that $3 million worth of subsidy, say. So when all these things get mixed together, it's really hard sometimes for the will of the voter to be heard. And so regulations that get passed and laws that get passed are not often reflecting what the actual voting preference is of the people, but what these special interest groups want. And so the first example where you see this and where you see Billie Holiday not happy about this situation, she writes about her mother who opened up a restaurant in Harlem and called it Mom Holidays. And so this comes from Billie Holiday's autobiography. She says, "Mom had always dreamed of having a real honest-to-God restaurant of her own with a framed license on the wall from the Board of Health. She wanted to give up that combination fried chicken parlor and after-hours soup kitchen for the local 802 and go legit. One night, Mom was campaigning for her damn restaurant when Brenda was at the house, and Brenda's a friend of Billie Holiday's. Right off, she offered to be an angel for the project. So she started planning and eventually ended up with a place of her own, Mom Holiday's, on 99th Street near Columbus. It wasn't long before I was sorry. Going legit couldn't change the Duchess. Nobody could just be a customer. Half of local 802 was soon hanging around. All you had to do was say you were a musician or a friend of mine and you could get anything in the joint. Cats could come in and order themselves a big feed and give her a story instead of money. The best paying customer she had was me. Every time I went in the place, I paid for something. One time she'd have a long face on waiting for me. The Board of Health was here, she'd say. They said we have to have 2 toilets. The damn Board of Health would pass by thousands of Harlem tenements with no damn toilets at all, then land on the Duchess and tell her that she had to have 2. So it would take a few $100 for that. Then the next time I'd turn around and she'd say, the Board of Health was here again. They said I can't fry hamburgers in a pan anymore. I've got to have a griddle. So I handed over another few bucks for a griddle. 50 for this and 40 for that. I don't know how much it cost me to keep the Board of Health happy, but it was plenty. And I never got half a quarter. And 2 minutes? So that situation there, you can see how For someone like the Holidays, who are moving into New York with nothing, basically, and are coming out of the Jim Crow South, opening up a kitchen where you're already frying chicken, you're giving it away to people, if you try to turn that into a business venture, if you don't have the capital and the means to keep paying for the Board of Health regulations, it's really easy for this to be shut down. The other part of that story is that Billie is mad at her mom, too, for not actually being a real entrepreneur and like getting, you know, people to pay her for her services. But if Billie Holiday were not a jazz singer, she may not have been able to help her mom with that restaurant at all. And then one other example here that shows us really well is that there's a cabaret law in New York City where every jazz singer had to be licensed and fingerprinted by the city of New York. And Billie refers to this and she says that it must have been an old law that was left over from Prohibition, and how I won't get into it more here, but she gets really upset about how this law made it really hard for her to get a job in New York. And if you look at the way this was passed in 1926, New York City's Board of Aldermen did pass this law. They exempted large hotels from this, but if any place that served food also had live singing and dancing or music happening, then an occupational licensing law said that everyone who worked there had to have their fingerprints and their picture taken. A lawyer in 1960 tells the New York Post that this law was passed. He says, to understand why this was enacted, you must recall that during Prohibition, better than 90% of the speakeasies were controlled by racketeers. So here is a law that has to be passed in order to counteract an unforeseen consequence of another law, Prohibition. And so in New York City's police department takes over in 1931. There's a photograph studio that opens up next door to where the licenses were given out. And even if you showed up with your own picture, the New York police were forcing people to go buy a new photograph from the get a new photograph taken at the photographic studio right next door. So this is just there are lots of examples. Billie says lots of things in her book around these same topics. But she has this inner full economic reasoning. And just to close, she's not an aberration. Harlem has a lot of libertarian thought in it during the Renaissance period. So of course, H.L. Mencken, we know him in the upper left-hand corner. He's writing in the NAACP's journal, The Crisis, and he's a main figure for a lot of the intellectuals who were in the Harlem Renaissance. Zora Neale Hurston in the upper right-hand corner. She's actually been written about by David Beto and his wife Linda Beto, and Robert Long's written about her. She has deep libertarian roots in her thoughts. She's a she's a writer in the Harlem Renaissance. These two on the bottom is George Schuler and Rosewater Lane. George Schuler was actually the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier after he left Harlem in the 20s. The Pittsburgh Courier was the largest Negro newspaper in the country at that time, and Rosewater Lane was writing free market columns for them in the 30s and 40s, and those two were actually really close personal friends. So Harlem has not been told in this way because most of the scholars who write on Harlem are either not familiar with what they're seeing or they don't like what they're seeing. But I think there's a lot more classical liberalism in Black American history than most people realize, and hopefully now